The final medical examiner's report for Elias Thorne, dated November 14, 2006, runs 72 pages long. Yet it fails to provide a single biologically viable explanation for his cause of death. I have a physical copy of that report on the desk in front of me. The clinical terminology used by the county coroner attempts to describe an impossible physiological state. According to the autopsy, the alveolar tissue in Thorne's lower lungs had undergone complete fibrotic displacement, replaced over a span of 8 years by a dense crystalline basalt structure. He did not succumb to an infection. He did not die from a standard respiratory disease. He suffocated because his internal pulmonary architecture had slowly converted into heavy, porous volcanic rock. The coroner classified it as an anomalous environmental calcification. The administrative bodies quietly sealed the file, attributing his condition to extreme occupational exposure to unmapped subterranean particulates. But I know the truth of the matter. I know the exact coordinates where that exposure occurred. And I know the precise date the process began. I am the only remaining member of the 1998 topographical extraction team that pulled Elias Thorne out of the Oregut Basin. And as my own breathing grows shallower, carrying the faint metallic scent of pulverized stone, I am recording this deposition to clarify the permanent consequences of violating silent boundaries. For 34 years, I served as a senior regional surveyor and wilderness extraction guide for the Department of Natural Resources. Stationed primarily along the coastal sub-boreal pine systems of the Pacific Northwest, my jurisdiction covered some of the most unforgiving, densely packed temperate rainforests on the continent, a landscape defined by perpetual marine fog, jagged coastal shelves, and towering Sitka spruce. It was a career built on meticulous routine, strict adherence to protocol, and a deep, quiet respect for the natural laws that governed the deep timber. Our operations were clinical and highly disciplined. We mapped subsidence zones, monitored tectonic shifts along the coastal faults, and provided specialized logistical support when civilian search and rescue teams failed to locate missing hikers in the more treacherous, high-gradient ravines. I spent my life reading the weather patterns, the soil compositions, and the barometric fluctuations of the basin. I knew the environment intimately, and more importantly, I knew its rules. In the Oregut Basin, specifically within the western boundary of Grid 44, there existed a series of naturally occurring geological formations known to local historical archives as the hollow columns. These were massive, hexagonal pillars of ancient basalt thrust upward through the forest floor by seismic activity thousands of years ago. They were unique in that they were not solid. Due to a geothermal anomaly during their formation, the columns were cavernous inside, trapping pockets of ancient pressurized atmosphere. For generations, the indigenous conservation officers and the older local guides operated under a strict localized mandate regarding these structures. The rule was never officially written into any departmental safety manual, but it was universally understood by anyone who spent enough time in the basin. You do not strike the columns. You do not anchor into the columns. You do not fracture the stone and allow the trapped air to bleed out into the active forest ecosystem. The older trackers referred to them as the sealed lungs of the earth. warning that puncturing the rock would trigger an immediate and irreversible environmental rejection. As a man of science and administration, I respected the cultural heritage of the warning, treating it as a practical guideline for preserving fragile geological features. I never intended to test the literal validity of the mandate. The violation of that rule occurred out of sheer administrative necessity during a severe operational emergency on the afternoon of October 12, 1998. At approximately 1400 hours, our station received an automated distress telemetry signal from a civilian geological research team operating deep within Grid 44. The team consisted of 3 university researchers, including Elias Thorne, who were conducting soil acidity tests along the basal fault lines. The telemetry data indicated a catastrophic failure of their primary climbing rig, placing them at the bottom of a steep, unstable ravine bordered by the basalt columns. Standard protocol required immediate deployment, as the Regional Weather Service was tracking a massive offshore squall projected to make landfall by nightfall. A temperature drop of 20 degrees, combined with heavy coastal precipitation, would guarantee hypothermia for anyone immobilized in the ravine. I led a specialized extraction unit consisting of myself, 2 senior rigging specialists named Eris and Vance, and a field medic. We loaded into the transport vehicle with 300 pounds of static ropes, titanium pythons, mechanical winches, and portable medical stabilization gear. The drive to the edge of Grid 44 took 2 hours over deteriorating logging roads, followed by an hour of intense physical traversal through the dense, rain-slicked underbrush. The atmosphere in the forest was heavy, the ambient humidity holding the scent of decaying pine needles and wet earth. We arrived at the ridge overlooking the ravine at 17:30 hours. The situation below was critical. The civilian researchers were stranded on a narrow ledge 60 feet down, pinned against a sheer rock face by a minor landslide. Elias Thorne had sustained a compound fracture to his left femur and was already showing signs of advanced shock. The remaining 2 researchers were attempting to stabilize him, but the ledge was crumbling under their combined weight. We had less than an hour to set a mechanical advantage hauling system, package Thorne in a rigid litter, and winch him up the vertical face before the ledge gave way completely. I initiated standard rigging procedures, scanning the immediate terrain for viable anchor points. This is where the environmental reality conflicted with our protocol. The soil along the ridge was heavily saturated, composed of loose loam and decaying root systems. None of the surrounding timber possessed the root stability required to support a tensioned multi-person extraction system. The only structurally sound features on the ridge were the hollow basalt columns. Eris reported the lack of viable timber anchors, noting that driving pickets into the mud would result in a catastrophic anchor failure the moment we applied the load of the litter. Vance confirmed the assessment, stating that our only option for setting a bomb-proof anchor was to drill directly into the nearest basalt column and place expansion bolts. I looked at the dark, weathered stone of the column. The ancestral warning was clear in my memory, but the clinical reality of Thorne's fading vital signs dictated my decision. I authorized the placement of the bolts into the restricted geological feature.
Vance powered up the portable rotary hammer drill, fitting a hardened carbide bit into the chuck.
The mechanical whine of the motor cut through the natural sounds of the forest.
I watched as he aligned the bit with the center of the column and engaged the drill. The moment the carbide tip breached the outer crust of the basalt,
the environment responded in a manner that defied every known principle of physics and meteorology. There was no explosion. There was no theatrical display of force.
There was only a sudden, highly localized hiss of expelled gas, followed immediately by an absolute crushing cessation of sound. The Oz effect is a term used in wilderness survival literature to describe the sudden silencing of the natural environment, often preceding a major weather event. What we experienced was not a natural silencing. It was a complete removal of acoustic physics.
The whine of the drill motor vanished, though the bit continued to spin.
The rustle of the wind in the spruce canopy ceased to register.
The distant, rhythmic echo of the coastal surf,
which had been a constant background frequency for the entire hike, simply dropped out of existence. The silence was so profound that it manifested as a physical pressure against the tympanic membrane.
Simultaneously, the portable barometer clipped to my harness registered a mathematically impossible drop in atmospheric pressure.
Within 3 seconds, the needle plunged from a standard 1,010 millibars down to 940 millibars. The air grew instantly, unnaturally cold. The ambient temperature plummeted, bypassing the gradual cooling of a storm front and settling into a deep, radiating chill that seeped directly into the synovial fluid of our joints. A new scent saturated the air, overriding the smell of wet pine. It was the sharp, metallic odor of oxidized copper, mixed with the distinct scent of electrical ozone. It tasted heavy on the tongue, leaving a dry, alkaline residue in the back of the throat.
Despite the sensory displacement, our professional training held. Vance secured the expansion bolts, the drill operating in total silence.
And Eris locked the carabiners into place.
We rigged the mechanical advantage system and deployed the litter down into the ravine.
The entire extraction was conducted in this heavy pressurized vacuum. We operated using hand signals.
As our voices failed to travel further than a few inches from our mouths, swallowed instantly by the deadened air,
we hauled Thorne and the 2 uninjured researchers up over the lip of the ravine. The moment the litter crossed the threshold of the ridge, the physical properties of the forest began to systematically break down. Standard procedure for a medical evacuation in fading light requires plotting a direct, linear compass heading back to the transport vehicle, verified by topographical map reading and altimeter checks. I pulled my field compass to set our egress heading. The magnetic needle was locked. It did not drift or spin erratically. It was rigidly fixed to a 42-degree eastern declination. Unresponsive to the rotation of the housing or the physical turning of my body, I signaled to Eris to check his GPS unit. He shook his head, holding up the screen. The digital display was frozen, the coordinate data replaced by a solid block of static pixels.
We were entirely stripped of our navigational telemetry, relying on 30 years of terrain familiarity. I established a dead reckoning heading based on the natural slope of the basin. The transport vehicle was parked at an elevation of 400 feet. Our current position was at 900 feet. To reach the extraction point, we simply had to follow the gradient downward. We began the descent, carrying Thorne's litter between us. The marine fog, which had been a thin, drifting mist, thickened into a dense, static suspension. It did not swirl or move with the wind. It hung in the air like heavy gray water, reducing our visibility to less than 10 feet. The light filtering through the canopy took on a sickly, luminescent quality, casting no shadows. After 45 minutes of steady downward hiking, I called a halt to check our progress. The physical exertion was taking a massive toll on the team. The air felt thick, requiring deep, labored breaths that pulled the metallic scent of copper deep into our lungs. I checked my mechanical altimeter, expecting to see a reading of roughly 700 feet. The needle read 1,100 feet, according to the instrument, despite walking continuously downhill. We had gained 200 feet in elevation. I tapped the glass face of the dial, assuming a mechanical malfunction due to the barometric anomaly. I verified the reading with Vance's altimeter. It showed the same impossible metric. We continued moving, shifting our heading slightly to compensate for what I assumed was a gradual rise in the terrain hidden by the fog. We walked for another 2 hours. The silence remained absolute, broken only by the synchronized crunch of our boots on the damp soil, a sound that seemed muffled, as if we were walking underwater. The physical strain became excruciating. My nose began to bleed, the blood running thick and dark, a clear symptom of rapid pressure changes. Vance reported severe vertigo, noting a complete loss of spatial orientation. At 2100 hours, we broke through a dense thicket of spruce and found ourselves standing on the edge of a sheer drop. The fog parted just enough for us to recognize the topography. We were standing exactly where we had started. We were back at the ridge, looking down into the ravine where Thorne had fallen, the hollow basalt column. Complete with the titanium bolts we had drilled into its surface, stood directly in front of us. We had marched downward in a straight line for nearly 3 hours, only to be seamlessly looped back to the origin of the breach. The environment was not merely disorienting us, it was actively rejecting our egress. The spatial geometry of Grid 44 had folded on itself, creating a quarantined loop centered entirely around the fractured stone. The ancestral warning was no longer a piece of historical trivia. It was a functional description of a localized defense mechanism. The Earth had sealed its lungs, and by puncturing that seal, we had exposed ourselves to a frequency that the human body was never meant to process. The hum began then. It did not start as an audible sound, but rather as a physiological vibration that originated from the fractured basalt. It resonated in the marrow of our bones, a low, grinding frequency that matched the tectonic friction of the deep fault lines. The vibration caused the fluid in our inner ears to crystallize momentarily, resulting in a wave of blinding nausea. Eris dropped to his knees, clutching his head. The civilian researchers were curled on the ground in a state of catatonic shock. I knew then that our technical equipment was useless. Our standardized protocols were designed for a physical reality that no longer applied within this grid. The only way to break the loop was to stop trying to navigate by human logic. I gathered the team, communicating through tight, deliberate hand gestures. I instructed them to ignore their compasses, to ignore the altimeters, and to ignore the visual feedback of the slope. We would not walk downhill, and we would not walk in a straight line. I took the lead, closing my eyes for long intervals, moving purely by the tactile sensation of the air pressure. When the pressure increased, indicating we were nearing the center of the anomaly, I turned us away. We navigated by avoiding the dense pockets of ozone, charting a blind, erratic path through the timber, seeking the path of least atmospheric resistance. It was a grueling, agonizing process. We dragged the litter through dense brush and jagged rock outcroppings, our bodies aching from the gravitational weight of the localized pressure field. We marched in silence for another 6 hours. At 0400 hours, the transition occurred. It was not gradual. One moment we were submerged in the heavy, static silence, and the next we crossed an invisible threshold. The auditory world snapped back into existence with staggering violence. The roaring crash of the offshore squall hit us instantly. The wind howled through the canopy, driving freezing rain into our faces. The ambient temperature stabilized to the natural cold of the storm. The oppressive smell of copper was violently washed away by the scent of fresh rain and wet pine. I checked my compass. The needle swung freely, settling on true north. The altimeter read 410 feet. We had broken through the quarantine line. Less than 50 yards ahead, the reflective decals of our transport vehicle gleamed in the beam of my headlamp. We evacuated Thorne and the researchers to the Regional Medical Center. The official after-action report documented a severe navigational delay caused by heavy fog and equipment failure due to barometric interference from the storm. The department commended the team for executing a successful medical extraction under extreme weather conditions. The broken basalt column was left unmentioned, categorized as a minor, irrelevant detail of the rigging process. But the environment does not recognize administrative commendations. The environment only recognizes actions and consequences. We had escaped the spatial loop, but the exposure to the anomaly was complete. We had inhaled the expelled atmosphere of the hollow stone. We had been marked by the frequency, and the consequence was merely delayed. The degradation of the extraction team occurred systematically over the following decade. It was not a sudden violent curse, but a slow clinical rejection of our biology. Vance was the first to experience the symptoms. 3 years after the incident, he applied for early medical retirement. His formal deposition stated that he was suffering from severe, untreatable vertigo and a constant, low-frequency tinnitus. He reported that the ringing in his ears sounded exactly like the grinding of heavy stone. He lost his sense of balance entirely, eventually requiring a wheelchair. He passed away in his sleep in 2002, his autopsy revealing massive unexplained calcification in his inner ear canals. ARIS lasted until 2004. He transferred out of the field and took a desk assignment in the archives. I visited him a month before he died. He had lost his vision. He sat in his darkened office, his eyes clouded over with a thick gray film. He told me, in a voice barely above a whisper, that he could no longer feel the passage of time. He said that every time he took a breath, he felt the weight of the mountain pressing down on his chest. His official cause of death was recorded as a rapid, atypical form of pulmonary fibrosis. The civilian researchers suffered similar, heavily redacted fates. Elias Thorne lived the longest, his body fighting the mineralization process for 8 years before his lungs finally hardened into unyielding basalt.
I am the last one left.
I retired from the department 5 years ago, settling into a quiet cabin far from the coastal fault lines. But distance does not mitigate the consequence of a broken rule. Over the past 6 months, the symptoms have begun to manifest. It started with a persistent dry cough, bringing up small amounts of fine gray dust that tastes of oxidized copper. My altimeter, which sits on the shelf above my desk, occasionally drops 50 millibars in a matter of seconds, despite the clear weather outside. More concerning is the auditory displacement. When I sit in the quiet of the evening, the natural sounds around my cabin begin to fade. The wind dies down. The hum of the refrigerator ceases. And in that heavy, pressurized silence, I can hear the deep, rhythmic grinding of tectonic plates echoing up from beneath the floorboards. I am documenting this account as a formal administrative archive. It is not a plea for medical intervention, nor is it a ghost story meant to frighten inexperienced hikers. It is a clinical record of a biological and spatial reality that exists just beyond the edges of our mapped grids. The wilderness is not merely a collection of trees, rocks, and weather systems. It is an ancient, highly structured mechanism, governed by laws that operate on a scale we cannot fully comprehend. The ancestral warnings passed down by the indigenous guides were not superstitions, they were precise. Operational manuals for surviving in a landscape that barely tolerates our presence. When you venture into the deep timber, you must understand that your specialized gear, your titanium anchors, and your mechanical winches are entirely irrelevant if you violate the foundational rules of the environment. There are boundaries in the earth that are sealed for a reason. There are stones that must remain unbreathed. When you puncture those boundaries, you do not awaken a monster. You simply trigger an autoimmune response from the earth itself. And once that process begins, once the environment decides that you are a contaminant, there is no extraction protocol that can save you. The loop will close, the air will turn to stone, and the consequence will unfold. Slowly and permanently, until there is nothing left but the quiet, heavy hum of the deep earth.